the history of horror, at least horror films in America.
Yeah,
The
yeah.
first two films that were called horror films were Dracula and Frankenstein in 1931. And in fact, the first time the word horror is used publicly, like, the word was used, but the first time people said these are horror films, like that's what these are. These are a horror cycle, a cycle of films that are about horror, were about both those films. So Dracula had come out in February, had been very successful. Universal, because of the success of that film, decided to make Frankenstein. And then people started saying, oh, these are horror films. So that was the first time people said, okay, this is a type of film that's horror. So
Yeah.
what's interesting to me is Dracula and Frankenstein, particularly that 1931 edition, are kind of the two faces of horror. Dracula is a threatening other. He is foreign. He is not, there's nothing good. He's seductive, but in an evil way. He is there to destroy the family, to corrupt women, to infect people. He is that traditional pestilent foreign other that people use to create xenophobic kinds of fears. But Frankenstein is kind of the other side of the coin. Frankenstein is this creation who is a bit of a misfit. He doesn't understand the world. He things are strange. He's not evil or violent. He just doesn't understand. And ultimately, if you people watch that 1931 film of Frankenstein, while the monster is frightening, the angry mob of white people who come to kill him are more frightening, because he just doesn't fit in. So I think those two sides of the coin, the threatening other and the kind of misfit who just doesn't quite make sense in the world and doesn't mean to be bad, but he just doesn't fit. And those are, I think, the two faces of horror that keep sort of cycling through our popular culture. Horror films do typically depict the other as somehow threatening, and that's the source of fear. But I think you're absolutely right that horror films, especially good horror films, ask us to think about who is really the dangerous person. So I mean, Frankenstein's a great example. I'll jump forward a little bit. Alfred Hitchcock's film Psycho, 1960, very important film, hugely influential. That's a brilliant film because it plays with our sympathies and with our fears about who is the monster and who are we supposed to be afraid of? Because Norman Bates is, for much of the film, very sympathetic.
Very sympathetic, yeah, and also harmless.
Absolutely, yeah. And sort of this damaged young man, and your heart breaks for him. And then in the end, you find out that all of that damage, all of that maltreatment has manifested in this other way. So I think, when horror is really effective, it doesn't just say, here's the monster, but it really asks us to look into the eyes of the monster and ask, why is it that this is threatening? Why am I afraid of this? And in some ways to ask us to see from the point of view of the monster, how they got to where they were. I think what you find is it's partly the kind of monster. So we see in the history of horror shifts from supernatural monsters. And certainly there was a period where ghosts were very prominent, and then that drifted away. So you had periods of supernatural horror, and that was really that first period, 1931 till about 1948 or so, where everything is about traditional Victorian English Gothic monsters. So you just go through the literary shelf, Mary Shelley, Bram Stoker, Robert Louis Stevenson, H.G. Wells, right? You're just pulling these famous figures off the Edgar Allan Poe, etc. By the time you get to the 50s, that traditional supernatural spooky monster from beyond the grave was not connecting with an America that was in the midst of the space race and the arms race and the nuclear age. And so you see a pivot to where the more prominent narratives of horror are told from a more science fiction. So that's where we get the kind of monster, the creature feature. The monster is from outer space, not from beyond the grave, right? So there's a kind of pivot, which clearly makes sense in terms of the U.S. during the Cold War and anxiety about the contest with the Soviet Union and about the bomb and about whether technology was leading us to a better place or to, a really horrible place. So that kind of develops through the 50s. And then as you get into the 60s, you find this increasing sort of psychological and internal. So Psycho's a great example. I think Rosemary's Baby, while that is supernatural possession, it's really about the family. Very similar to George Romero's Night of the Living Dead. It's much more about internal America. So the threat is not coming from the outside. It's that we are rotten from the core. And in Romero's Night of the Living Dead, it's racism. It's the failure of the generations to work together. It's the inherent weakness of the nuclear family. That means that little house that's defending them from those zombies, it doesn't get destroyed. It just collapses from within. The people can't work together, which is very much where America was in 1968. We were divided by race, by class, by generation. We were torn by the war in Vietnam. And so that internal struggle ends up getting projected. And so the monsters on the screen increasingly look like us as opposed to look like some sort of alien other. And so you sort of see that shift in the way the monster is depicted as the culture and the nation's anxieties move from concerns about, sexual morality to concerns about alien invasion to concerns about, internal weakness and collapse of the family and the culture and the nation. That narrative keeps adjusting to stay relevant. That's one of the key things with horror. Horror has to stay current. Even if you tell old horror stories, and we have a lot of those, people taking films from the 70s or 80s and remaking them. But when they remake a movie like, say, Candyman, the remake is really about now. Like, we're not just telling a traditional ghost story. We're telling a story for right now. And I think horror, more than any other genre, has to stay culturally relevant or it stops being scary. Right. This is why when I show my students Dracula or Frankenstein, they often laugh, they giggle, like it's silly to them. I think it's silly partly because of the filmmaking and partly because of the special effects, but partly because that just feels like old scary things are not scary anymore. I think is interesting about that is you're absolutely right. There's a long tradition in horror of there being a kind of forbidden portal or threshold, right? So you're told, don't go in the woods. And you go in the woods, right? Or don't go in that creepy old man. There's a great moment at the beginning of Dracula where someone says, where the first guy, Renfield says, "I'm going to Castle Dracula," and the villagers say, "Don't go to Castle Dracula." Well, he was told, right? He was told, and he went, and then it all went badly. What I think is interesting now, at least what seems to be a kind of prominent theme in American films, is it's often about your home. It's not so much about you going out to someplace else, but it is these things visiting you in your home. So there's certainly a lot of home invasion films, but even the very, very popular, again, haunted house films have kind of returned. So films like Paranormal Activity and The Conjuring and Insidious, and you got this, and they're all about, in some ways, they're all about the terror of what happens when your safe place becomes unsafe. And sometimes that happens because you bring an object in the home or you do something wrong, but sometimes it just happens. Like, these things are just coming for you. And I think that adds to this kind of paranoid phase of horror where we cannot trust. We can't trust each other.
Yeah.
We can't trust our house. We can't trust our family. We can't trust the police or the government or the world around us. The world is just untrustworthy. And what, as you said before, what do you do in a world that is not trustworthy? Well, you have two choices. You can leave it by burning it or whatever, or you can just try to survive. And so It Follows is a great example. At the end, you just got to keep trying to survive. Like,